If you think death by hanging or suffocation is the most brutal method of ending a person's life, then think again, because this video will leave you shocked at the level of inhumanity that has been melted out on people. This is mysterious and wild, and today I'll be taking you through the shocking stories of people who met these ends in the most brutal and gruesome ways. Discussing brutal killing techniques is undeniably a dark and disturbing subject because it's one that takes us into the grimmest corners of human history, where cruelty and violence were used as tools for control, punishment, and warfare. So what were these techniques about? Let's dive in. Number 1, the brazen bull. The brazen bull is one of the most notorious torture devices from ancient Greece, specifically designed to kill victims in the most horrific way possible. The brazen bull was a large, hollow bronze statue in the shape of a bull, and it was created by Perilos of Athens for Phalaris, the tyrant of Akragas in Sicily. For this technique, the victim would be placed inside the bull, and a fire would be lit underneath it. As the metal heated up, the person inside would be slowly roasted to death. The design of the brazen bull was particularly cruel because the statue was engineered so that the screams of the dying person would be transformed into sounds resembling the bellowing of a bull, creating a gruesome spectacle for onlookers. Also, the purpose of the brazen bull was not just to execute, but to do so in a way that was both torturous and symbolic, turning the victim's agony into a form of twisted entertainment. Number 2, the rack. The rack is one of the most infamous torture devices used during the medieval period, a device that was as simple as it was cruel. This rectangular frame had rollers at each end, to which the victim's hands and feet would be tied. And as the rollers were turned, the victim's body would be stretched, often to the point of dislocation, or even tearing the limbs from the body. The pain inflicted by the rack was excruciating, as the muscles, joints, and bones would be subjected to extreme stress, leading to a slow and agonizing death. Now, the rack wasn't just used to kill, but was also employed to extract confessions from prisoners. In fact, the fear and pain of being stretched beyond one's physical limits would often force victims to admit to crimes they hadn't even committed, making it as much a tool of psychological torture as a physical one. Number 3, scaphism, also known as the boats, is perhaps one of the most bizarre and horrifying execution methods from ancient Persia. The technique involved placing the victim inside 2 boats, or hollowed-out tree trunks, leaving only the head, hands, and feet exposed. The executioners would then force-feed the victim with milk and honey, which would induce severe diarrhea. The victim would also be smeared with more honey and left exposed to the elements, particularly in swamps or other areas infested with insects. Now here's the scary part. This milk and honey diet would attract insects, which would begin to eat away at the victim's exposed flesh. Also, the forced diarrhea would further attract pests and lead to a gradual infection. Death by scaphism was slow and agonizing, as the victim was eaten alive by insects over several days, sometimes even weeks. This method was particularly brutal, not just because of the physical pain, but also because of the psychological torment of being slowly consumed by insects. Number 4, the blood eagle. The blood eagle is one of the most cruel execution methods attributed to the Vikings. It's said that this method of torture was reserved for those who had committed particularly heinous crimes, such as betraying their lord or family. The process involved laying the victim face down and cutting open their back. The ribs would be severed from the spine, and the lungs pulled out through the openings to create the appearance of wings. The victim would then be left to die in this excruciating position. Note that there are many speculations about this history. However, whether or not the blood eagle was actually practiced as described, the very idea of it is particularly horrifying. This is because the technique combines extreme physical torture with symbolic desecration, turning the victim's body into a sad display of vengeance. Even the psychological impact of witnessing or even hearing about such an execution would have been immense, reinforcing the power and brutality of those who carried it out. Number 5. Impalement is one of the most brutal and prolonged methods of execution ever used, particularly associated with Vlad the Impaler, the 15th century ruler of Wallachia. In this method, a sharpened stake would be driven through the victim's body, usually through the rectum or female private part, and out through the mouth, neck, or chest. The stake was often left blunt to prolong the victim's agony, as the body would slowly slide down the stake under its own weight, leading to an excruciatingly slow death. Impalement was particularly designed to be as humiliating as it was painful. Victims could linger for hours, even days, in unimaginable agony, with their suffering on full display for others to see. This method of execution was often used to send a message, serving as a deterrent to enemies or rebels. And it worked, because the psychological terror that this process instilled was as much a part of its purpose as the physical pain. Number 6. Drawing and quartering. This was a form of capital punishment used in England, particularly for those convicted of high treason. The method was not only brutal, but also involved a series of steps that inflicted maximum suffering. First, the victim would first be hanged until near death, then released and castrated, with their parts burned before their eyes. Finally, the body would be divided into 4 parts, often with the head displayed on a pike. The sheer brutality of drawing and quartering ensured that the victim would suffer immensely, with the entire process often taking hours. Also, the psychological impact on both the victim and the public was profound, reinforcing the absolute power of the monarchy. Number 7. Torture with rats. Being trapped with rats is horrifying enough, but medieval torture methods took this terror to another level. One of the most sadistic and gruesome techniques involved strapping a cage, open on one side, directly against the victim's body, and allowing the rats to wreak havoc. So here's how it worked. The victim, fully restrained, usually tied down to a flat surface, would have slits cut into their abdomen. Starving rats were then placed inside the slits, where they would begin to eat their way through the victim's body. This process of eating through the victim's intestines could take hours or even days, inflicting unimaginable agony, and unless this torture was stopped early, it would almost always result in death, either from infection or from some other quicker, but equally fatal cause. Number 8. Crucifixion. This is perhaps one of the most well-known forms of execution, historically associated with the Roman Empire, and famously with the death of Jesus Christ. It's a technique that involved nailing or binding the victim's hands and feet to a large wooden cross, and then leaving them to hang until death. This position of the body on the cross made breathing incredibly difficult, leading to a slow death from asphyxiation, shock, or exhaustion. Note that crucifixion was not only a physically agonizing way to die, but it was also a public action designed to humiliate and dehumanize the victim. This combination of prolonged suffering and public spectacle made crucifixion one of the most feared execution methods in the ancient world. The brutal killing techniques explored in this video represent some of the darkest aspects of human history. And sadly, the methods were not just about death, but rather about inflicting as much pain, fear, and humiliation as possible. Whether used as a form of punishment, control, or psychological warfare, each of these techniques highlights the capacity for cruelty that has existed throughout history. What other brutal killing techniques do you know of? Let me know in the comment section. And if you'd like to learn about other mysterious and wild topics, then be sure to like this video and subscribe.